Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. This means that, dependent upon karma formation, there arises resultant consciousness. Here, resultant consciousness is referring to the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. We have to remember two, though. Viññāṇaṃ refers to the 19 types of rebirth or relinking consciousness, too. But in terms of one's lifetime, it refers to the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. What are the 32 types? They are the 15 types of rootless resultant consciousness, the 8 types of mahavipaka, and the 9 types of sublime resultant consciousness. We call these 32 types of consciousness mundane resultant consciousness. Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ is very important. How do we become human beings? How do some beings become angels, animals, or Brahma? We have to discuss this in detail so that we understand. If we don't understand, wrong view can arise. Some people think that whatever we do in life, after we die, the soul that existed in our body does not die. They think there's an immortal soul there. But, according to the Buddha's teachings, there are no permanent things. Our mind, for example, arises and then disappears. Before a given mind disappears, the force of one's previous karma transfers to the next mind as it arises. We studied in the first chapter of the second book that one mind arises and disappears, and then another mind arises, right? After a given mind arises, and before it disappears, all good or bad karma from the past is transferred to the new mind as it arises. It just keeps going on like this. This is what is meant when we say that because of karma formation, rebirth consciousness arises. We have 19 types of rebirth consciousness. What are they? In rootless consciousness, we have 2 types. They are the 2 types of investigating consciousness, accompanied by indifferent feeling. Beings reborn in the woeful states have one of these as their relinking consciousness, right? Do you remember that from the first chapter of the first book? There is resultant wholesome consciousness and resultant unwholesome consciousness. Resultant unwholesome investigating consciousness is the rebirth consciousness for those reborn in the 4 woeful states. This consciousness takes as its function or duty for beings to be reborn as hell beings, animals, ghosts, or demons. Why does this happen to such beings? Because of Saṅkhāra. What kind of Saṅkhāra? What kind of formation? Formation of demerit. See 33 Las Vegas, Sayadaw that? Because of formation of demerit, in other words, dependent upon formation of demerit, that rebirth consciousness arises in a woeful state. Can you see how formation of demerit is the cause, and rebirth consciousness is the effect? So Saṅkhāra produces Viññāṇaṃ. It doesn't support it, right? It produces Viññāṇaṃ to arise in a woeful state. Why does someone die and be reborn as a hell being, an animal, or a hungry ghost? Because of Saṅkhāra. What kind of Saṅkhāra? Formation of demerit, which produces rebirth consciousness in a woeful state. This is Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. What about those beings who are reborn as human beings, but have been blind, deaf, mute, or perhaps have a mental disorder since conception? And what about those beings who are reborn as spirits in the human world, but are very low-level spirits? Even though we may call these beings angels, they do not live in heaven. Instead, they get attached to trees, buildings, or perhaps stones. What is the relinking consciousness for the 2 types of beings that I just described? It is ahetuka kusala vipaka upeka santirana, or rootless wholesome resultant, investigating consciousness with indifferent feeling. Do you see how there are 2 types of rootless investigating consciousness with indifferent feeling? Hell beings and animals have one of them for their rebirth consciousness, and the 2 types of beings I just described have the other type. We're talking about Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ, right? What kind of Saṅkhāra? There's formation of demerit here too. But why are some of these beings reborn as human beings? Everyone reborn into the human world does so because of their past wholesome actions. But for these beings, they performed meritorious deeds without purity or complete wholesomeness. In other words, Their wholesomeness was mixed with unwholesomeness. I'll give you an example. Let's say a person wants to offer a meal to monks, but perhaps they kill a fish or a chicken as part of the dish they prepare. I mean, offering food to monks is a good thing, right? But killing is demeritorious. So this kind of person is reborn as a human being because of their meritorious deed, i.e., wholesome consciousness. But they are blind, deaf, or mute because of their demeritorious deed, i.e., unwholesome consciousness. See that? We're talking about Saṅkhāra paccayā 34, Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. Viññāṇaṃ. Here, Viññāṇa is ahetuka kusala vipaka upeka santirana. That's why they are reborn like this. I would like all of you to remember that avijja paccayā saṅkhāra, and that because of saṅkhāra, formation of merit, formation of demerit, or formation of imperturbable, relinking consciousness is produced. We will study this in more detail later. In fact, we will need to study all 19 kinds of rebirth consciousness. Also, we'll study why we experience good or bad things during our lifetimes. Why does this happen? We'll study how this happens as a matter of cause and effect. But we'll study all of this next month because in 10 minutes I need to leave to catch a flight to Burma. Our class will start up again in May, so there will be no class for the next few weeks. Okay, let's stop here. Thank you for understanding. Today is May 22nd, 1999. Last month, we studied avijja paccayā saṅkhāra and Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. We haven't finished Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ yet. Today, I want to do a little review of avijja paccayā saṅkhāra, which tells us that karma formations arise with ignorance as a condition. We already studied avijja, which is not knowing about the Four Noble Truths, and so on. The reality of avijja is moha cetasika. Moha cetasika is concomitant with the 12 types of unwholesome consciousness, akusala citta. This means that moha in akusala citta is called avijja. As for saṅkhāra, it is formation of merit, which embraces all volition, or cetana, in the 8 types of great wholesome consciousness and the 5 types of form sphere wholesome consciousness. Formation of demerit, which is volition in the 12 types of unwholesome consciousness. And formation of imperturbable, or unshakable, which refers to volition in the 4 types of formless sphere wholesome consciousness. These are the realities of saṅkhāra. So how many types of consciousness are we talking about here? There's the 8 types of great wholesome consciousness plus the 5 types of form sphere wholesome consciousness. That's 13 types. Then we have the 12 types of unwholesome consciousness. That totals 25 types. When we add the 4 types of formless sphere wholesome consciousness, that's a total of 29 types of consciousness. This means that cetana in these 29 types of consciousness are called saṅkhāra. See that? 35 Las Vegas Sayadaw. We're talking about taking wholesome and unwholesome consciousness here, right? The volition of the 4 types of supramundane wholesome consciousness is not regarded as saṅkhāra because the 4 supramundane paths, magga citta, tend to eradicate ignorance. Thus, they don't produce life. This is why supramundane whole consciousness is not taken here. So Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. In other words, with karma formation as a condition, rebirth or resultant consciousness arises. It takes 2, right? It takes the 19 types of rebirth consciousness and the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. This is their realities. Saṅkhāra takes cetana in 29 types of consciousness, and Viññāṇa takes the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. The 19 types of rebirth consciousness are included in the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. These 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness can be experienced during our lifetime. Last month, I explained that Viññāṇa can arise because of the formation of demerit. What kind of Viññāṇa? Rebirth consciousness. That rebirth consciousness would be ahetuka akusala vipaka upeka santirana. See that? Because of formation of demerit, Caitana in unwholesome consciousness, as the cause. Viññāṇaṃ, rebirth consciousness, arises as a result and performs its duty in the woeful states. In other words, unwholesome consciousness is the cause, and Viññāṇaṃ is the result. We're talking about formation of demerit here. This rebirth consciousness is ahetuka akusala vipaka upeka santirana. What about formation of merit? This means that we have one of the 8 types of great wholesome consciousness. We may practice generosity, morality, or perhaps meditation. We do good things, physically, verbally, or mentally. This is the cause. The cause is Saṅkhāra, which is Caitana in great wholesome consciousness. We're talking about Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ, right? So Viññāṇa then arises. What kind? Well, when we do meritorious things, we can have either 2 roots or 3 roots. If your meritorious deed is done without wisdom, that is, it's just a lobha and a dosa, it is jnana vipayutta. Do you remember this from the first chapter of the first book? So let's see what happens when there is wholesome consciousness without wisdom. We're talking here about doing something that is meritorious, yet there is greed, hatred, delusion, or some other mental defilement in the mind, either before or after that good deed. This is what is meant by a 36 Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ meritorious deed, being without wisdom and accompanied by mental defilement. As it is, it becomes inferior. Let's look at an example. Let's say your wholesome consciousness is the last one. Do you remember it from the first chapter of the first book? I'm talking about upeka sahagata jnana vipayutta sasaṅkārika, or with indifferent feeling, without wisdom, prompted, and thus inferior. The karma of this meritorious deed, formation of merit, if it gives a result in the next life, will be ahetuka kusala vipaka upeka santirana, or rootless wholesome resultant, investigating consciousness with indifferent feeling. See that? This rebirth consciousness will perform its duty in the human world, but this person may be blind, deaf, and so, from the point of conception. Alternatively, if the being is reborn as a god, he may protect a tree or a mountain, but won't have any real power. He'll be just a minor god because his rebirth consciousness was also ahetuka kusala vipaka upeka santirana. I really want you to understand what I'm talking about here. Because of Saṅkhāra, formation of merit, Viññāṇaṃ arises. What kind? Perhaps you now understand how it works. Let's look further at formation of merit, or cetana, in the 8 types of great wholesome consciousness. If you do a meritorious thing that is accompanied by pleasure and with wisdom, such as the first one, i.e., somanasa sahagata jnana sampayutta asaṅkārika, or with pleasure, with wisdom and unprompted. If it gives results, the results will be the same type of great resultant consciousness. In other words, with the first type of great wholesome consciousness as the cause. Rebirth will be the first type of great resultant consciousness as a result. See that? If you do something meritorious with the second type of great wholesome consciousness, accompanied by pleasurable feeling, with wisdom but prompted, then your rebirth consciousness will be the second one. In the same way, if you do some meritorious thing with an indifferent feeling, then your rebirth consciousness will also be upeka. This is why people are different. If your rebirth consciousness was accompanied by pleasurable feeling, we already studied this in the first chapter of the first book, right? Then you will have a smiling face and so on. If you did meritorious things with wisdom in your past life, you will be an intelligent person in this life. And if your rebirth consciousness was the first, second, fifth, or sixth types, accompanied by wisdom, of great resultant consciousness, you can become a noble person in this life. On 37 Las Vegas Sayadaw, on the other hand, if your rebirth consciousness was without wisdom, i.e., it was the third, fourth, seventh, or eighth types of great resultant consciousness, then you cannot become a noble person in this life. So what you did in the previous life counts. It is the cause. As for this present life, Your rebirth consciousness may have been with wisdom, or perhaps it was without wisdom. We're talking about Viññāṇaṃ as one of the 8 types of great resultant consciousness. The meritorious deeds you did may have been committed physically, verbally, or mentally. Perhaps they were dana, generosity, sila, morality, or maybe they were bhavana, meditation. Do you remember when we talked about this in detail in the 2nd chapter of the 2nd book? We talked about superior or inferior karma, 2 or 3 good roots, and so on. Remember that? We're reviewing that now. Let's look now at formation of merit with respect to the 5 types of form sphere wholesome consciousness. Once again, wholesome consciousness leads to resultant consciousness. Let's say you practice tranquility meditation and gain the first jhana. If your jhana is intact when you die, that is, you don't lose it, this Saṅkhāra or cetana, which in this case is the first type of form, sphere wholesome consciousness, will give results in the next life as Viññāṇaṃ, rebirth consciousness, of the first type of resultant consciousness. Do you remember the 31 planes of existence? That rebirth consciousness will perform its duty in the first jhana plane. There are 3 planes here, right? If you gain the 2nd jhana, the 2nd type of form sphere wholesome jhana, what will happen? We're talking about Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ, right? If your cetana is 2nd jhana consciousness, then after death your rebirth consciousness will be the 2nd type of form sphere resultant consciousness. As such, it will perform its duty at the 2nd form sphere jhana plane. We already talked about these 3 planes too, right? Once again, Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ means that because of your formation of merit, this cetana in form sphere wholesome consciousness will give rise to rebirth consciousness in the 2nd form sphere jhana plane. If you gain the 3rd jhana, this cetana in form sphere wholesome consciousness will produce which type of rebirth consciousness? The 3rd type of form sphere resultant consciousness. This rebirth consciousness will perform its duty in the 2nd jhana plane. 38 Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ. Now, with respect to the 2nd and 3rd jhanas, if you gain these, then your Viññāṇaṃ will be different. In other words, your rebirth consciousness is different, but the plane is the same. If you gain the 4th jhana, this cetana, volition, in the 4th type of form sphere, wholesome consciousness, will give rise to or produce relinking, rebirth consciousness in the 3rd jhana plane. 4th jhana wholesome consciousness will produce rebirth consciousness as 4th jhana resultant consciousness in the 3rd jhana plane. If you gain the 5th jhana, this cetana in the 5th type of form sphere, wholesome consciousness, will produce rebirth consciousness, Viññāṇaṃ. As the 5th type of form sphere resultant consciousness, this rebirth consciousness will perform its duty on the 4th jhana plane. How many 4th jhana planes are there? 7. They include Vihapala, Asaññasata, and the 5 pure abodes. So the 1st jhana plane has 3 levels. The 2nd jhana plane has 3 levels. The 3rd jhana plane has 3 levels. And the 4th jhana plane has 7 levels. Altogether, the form sphere consists of these 16 levels. Planes. What about someone who gains the 5th type of form sphere wholesome consciousness with the thought that there is great suffering because of consciousness and the mind? If he wishes to have only a body, so that the mind will no longer cause him suffering, then practicing tranquility meditation with that desire and attaining the 5th jhana would lead to rebirth upon death as a mindless being. Mindless beings are reborn on Asaññasata, which is part of the 4th jhana plane. The 5th jhana does not produce Viññāṇaṃ here, because rebirth in Asaññasata is devoid of consciousness. The rebirth of mindless beings is vital nonad, jivita navaka kalapa. Do you remember when we studied this in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd book? The rebirth of mindless beings does not include mind. It's just matter. Specifically, it's 9 kinds of matter, which we call vital nonad. So we've been talking about formation of merit. The cetana in the 5 types of form sphere wholesome consciousness produce the corresponding 5 types of resultant rebirth consciousness in the form sphere. The last one is formation of imperturbable or unshakable. The reality here is Saṅkhāra, in the 4 types of formless sphere wholesome consciousness. These 4 are called formation of imperturbable. If you gain the first type of formless sphere jhana, that Saṅkhāra will produce rebirth, resultant, consciousness in what plane? In the 39 Las Vegas Sayadaw corresponding first, resultant plane. Understand that? It depends on your jhana. In the same way, if you gain the second formless sphere jhana, the Saṅkhāra in that wholesome consciousness will produce Viññāṇaṃ, rebirth consciousness, in the corresponding second, resultant plane. If you gain the third type of formless sphere jhana, the Saṅkhāra in that wholesome consciousness will produce Viññāṇaṃ in the corresponding third, resultant plane. And if you gain the fourth formless sphere jhana, the Saṅkhāra in that wholesome consciousness will produce Viññāṇaṃ in the corresponding fourth resultant plane, which is the topmost of the 31 planes of existence. So, thus far in our discussion, Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ means that because of Saṅkhāra, Saṅkhāra in wholesome or unwholesome consciousness, there is Viññāṇaṃ, rebirth consciousness, in the 31 planes of existence. There is no creator, that is, no one creates animals or ghosts or hell beings or humans or gods or Brahma. What is their cause? Avijja paccayā Saṅkhāra, which means that because ignorance doesn't know the noble truths, tanha, craving or desire, arises. When a being has a desire to be reborn as a human being or in heaven, why does this so RT of craving arise? Because he doesn't know. Because he's ignorant. As such, he wants. Why does he want? Because he doesn't know. I'll elaborate. Avidya leads to tanha, and when the latter grows up and gets big, it becomes attachment, it becomes clinging, right? We cling to what we want, and then we have to do kama, saṅkhāra, right? We may do meritorious things, or we may do demeritorious things. But even if we do meritorious things, like practice generosity, morality, or meditation, either physically, verbally, or mentally, the existence of avidya, ignorance, leads to tanha, craving, and upadana, grasping, clinging, or attachment. Then there is saṅkhāra, kama, or action. With these 4 things, avidya, tanha, upadana, and saṅkhāra, as the cause, we become beings of various kinds within the 31 planes of existence. According to paticca samuppada, dependent origination, no one created us. This teaching explains the cause of life. Where's Viññāṇaṃ come from? Saṅkhāra. Where's Saṅkhāra come from? Avijja. See that? So we've been talking about Viññāṇaṃ in the context of rebirth consciousness. Because of Saṅkhāra, Sadhana, rebirth consciousness arises. How many types of rebirth consciousness are there? 19. They include the 2 types of upekkhasantirana, the 8 types of 40 Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ mahavipakka, the 5 types of rupavakara vipakka, and the 4 types of arupavakara vipakka. Those are the 19 types of rebirth consciousness. When it comes to a being's lifetime, the reality of Viññāṇaṃ is the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness. These are experienced during a being's lifetime. See, we're not talking about rebirth consciousness anymore. Let's start by looking at the 7 types of ahetuka akusala vipakka, or unwholesome resultant consciousness. Because of the formation of demerit in the previous life, the 7 types of unwholesome resultant consciousness arise in this life. As such, you will come across undesirable sights, sounds, odors, tastes, touches, and so on. Why do we come across these undesirable things? Because of formation of demerit, what we've done in the previous life. That is the cause. As for the formation of merit, in other words, what good we've done in the previous life, e.g., the 8 types of great wholesome consciousness, in this life we come across desirable objects. This is our experience of wholesome resultant consciousness. The pleasant sights, sounds, odors, tastes, touches, and so on that we experience now. are because of our formation of merit in the previous life. As a result, we come across these good or desirable objects in this life. With regard to the 8 types of Mahavipaka, great resultant consciousness, they don't only perform the function of rebirth. Do you remember when we studied the functions of the various types of consciousness in the 3rd chapter of the 1st book? Great resultant consciousness has 4 functions, right? Remember? What are they? Rebirth, bhavanga, life continuum, kuti, death, and tadaramana, registering. Do you remember when we studied these various functions one by one? Some types of consciousness have just one function. Others have 2, 3, 4, or 5. After jhana, tadaramana comes, right? Jhana experiences, enjoys the taste of the object. After 7 jhana arise and disappear, 2 tadaramana arise. What's their object? The same object as jhana consciousness. In this case, they have a good object. Why? Because of formation of merit. This is why we can also experience the 32 types of mundane resultant consciousness in this life. I'm sorry to interrupt. It seems that you usually talk about experiences in this life being the results of karma from our past life. But can they also, 41 Las Vegas Sayadaw, be the results of karma from earlier lives and/or from earlier in this present life? Sure. We're talking about Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ, right? Because of Saṅkhāra, formation of merit, formation of demerit, or formation of imperturbable, this Viññāṇa arises. This Viññāṇa is of 2 kinds, rebirth consciousness and resultant consciousness. Rebirth means that it takes place as the first consciousness of this present life, while bhavati is experiencing something in this lifetime. Here, you see desirable things. It has nothing to do with rebirth consciousness, right? What we experience in this life is bhavati. If we don't understand how rebirth takes place, it can become wrong view. It's very hard to understand how our life began through the process of rebirth. Without studying Abhidhamma, no one will understand their lives, how their rebirth took place, and why it did so. In the 2nd book, we studied the thought process of death. When we die, a thought process takes place with Atita bhavanga, past bhavanga, bhavanga kalana, vibrating bhavanga, bhavangupachera, arresting bhavanga, perhaps manodvaravajjana, mind or adverting consciousness, and soon enough, 5 jhana, then maybe 2 tadaramana, retention or registering consciousness. After that, there is kuti. Kuti is death consciousness, right? After kuti, which is the last consciousness of that life, patisandhi, rebirth consciousness, arises. Kuti and patisandhi are not the same though. Can you see how this is very hard to understand? For this reason, we have to think in terms of thought processes. Kuti death consciousness arises and disappears. After death consciousness disappears, rebirth consciousness takes place in the next life. But this doesn't mean that rebirth consciousness arises by itself without a cause. If we say that rebirth consciousness arises without a cause, that is, without connection with the previous life, it is a perspective we call annihilation. In other words, it's thinking that there is nothing after death. Right? This is a view of annihilation. On the other hand, if we say that rebirth consciousness started in the past life and then moved to the next life, this is a view called eternalism. We have to avoid both of these views. Annihilation and eternalism are wrong view. Rebirth consciousness does not come about 42 Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ all by itself, nor is it something that existed in the past and continued into the present. To understand this correctly, we need to look at examples. There's this problem of atta, or ego. Some people think that we have an ego. They might think this ego is in our body or in our heart. Right? This is what they might think. They might think that this ego controls or governs the doings of man. They might think that when this body dies, whether it's buried afterward or cremated, this permanent or immortal ego continues on to another body and becomes a new person. Some people think like this, and it's an incorrect view called eternalism. So let's look at some examples that give us a correct way of looking at how it works. If we enter a large cavern and shout, we will hear the echo of our voice. The echo is not our voice, right? Yet, the echo would not occur without our shouting or our voice. Can you see how the echo is not our original voice, yet it could not have existed without our original voice? It's cause and effect, right? Because of your shouting in the cave, you hear an echo of your voice. As another example, if you stand in front of a mirror, you will see your image on the mirror. That image is not you, though. You are not the image. Can you see how they are different? Because you stand in front of the mirror, your image appears on the mirror. That image is not you, yet it would not appear without you. For another example, if you light a candle, you can then use that candle to light other candles. When you do so, does that mean that the light from the first candle moved to the second or third candle? No, yet there would be no light on the second or third candle without the light from that first candle. Depending on the light of the first candle, second, third, or fourth candles can be lit. As yet another example, let's look at a seal. When you stamp a seal on a paper, you see its impression on the paper. The impression on the paper doesn't mean that the initial seal appeared on the paper, yet the impression couldn't be there without that initial seal. The initial seal caused the impression to appear, right? This is just cause and effect. As a matter of cause and effect, shouting becomes an echo. Your body in front of a mirror becomes an image on the mirror. An initial lit candle becomes other candles having light, and a seal becomes the impressions it leaves. In the same way, our 43 Las Vegas Sayadaw current life was dependent upon our previous life and our actions in it. Then, rebirth consciousness arose. Perhaps you remember how we studied thought processes in the first chapter of the second book. One thought, one mind, arises and disappears at the rate of 1 trillion per second. After a single mind arises, it instantly disappears. Before it disappears, it transfers its kamic properties to the next arising mind. As an example of this, we have 5 jhāvana in a death thought process. Right? The first jhāvana arises and disappears, but before it disappears, it transfers its kamic properties, i.e., good or bad actions, to the next arising mind. And the last consciousness of a given life, that is, death consciousness, carries all of these kamic properties from the life that is ending. Before it disappears, these kamic properties are transferred to rebirth consciousness. Can you see how our rebirth consciousness is dependent upon our past? Sometimes that manifests in a very curious way too. It can be very hard to understand these things. Let me tell you a story. I remember one of my friends from many years ago. We ordained as novices together. I can still remember his name, it was Kundala. Anyhow, he had been killed in his previous life. As the person was about to kill him, he'd raised his hand to his head, apologized, and said, "Please don't kill me." But the person killed him anyway, with a sword, which also severed his fingers and caused them to fall to the ground. In the next life, Kundala became my friend. He still had the scars on his hand and another scar on his neck. When he was 1 year old, he could remember what had happened in his previous life. He would later describe the person who killed him, how he was killed, and could even remember precise details about the event. He could explain exactly how he got those scars. It was very interesting. Perhaps a person was a professional dancer in their last life. After death, the person may be reborn as a girl who, at 2 or 3 years old, could dance, even without any instruction. They might remember how to dance after simply looking at people dancing on television. Not everyone can do that, right? This sort of thing is dependent upon that person's past life. The intrinsic natures of kamic properties from previous lives follow us. It's very important that we understand that speaking of from one life to another does not mean that our previous body or mind move on 44 Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ to the next. Nor does it mean that our present body goes to a future body after death. We should properly understand that the connection is one of cause and effect. Our body, our life, our mind are dependent upon our previous actions. Depending upon what we are doing in this present life, we will have to be reborn again in a future existence, in line with our good or bad actions. Our actions are our designers. They design our destiny in every life. I would like all of you to know that Saṅkhāra paccayā Viññāṇaṃ, because there are karma formations as a condition, rebirth consciousness or resultant consciousness arises. 45.